It was just an ordinary Tuesday morning, or at least it seemed that way at first. My name is Emma, and I was 16, living in a small town called Brookville, Ohio, the kind of place where nothing really happens, and the biggest drama at school is who's dating who. But that morning, something felt off. I could feel it in my gut even before I stepped on the bus. Brookville wasn't big, but it wasn't small enough to feel like we were all living in one big house. We had a single high school, and everyone rode the same bus. You'd see the same kids every day, sitting in the same spots, talking about the same boring stuff. My stop was at the end of a street called Oak Drive, which was lined with old houses that looked like they belonged in the 1950s. It was quiet, peaceful, and most of the time, you could hear birds chirping and cars driving by. But not that morning. I walked out of my house, the air feeling unusually cold for the middle of September. It was like the world was holding its breath. The bus was already at the curb when I got outside, the engine idling, sending a low hum through the air. I had this feeling like I was being watched, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. As I walked up to the bus, I noticed something odd. The windows were all fogged up, but not from the inside. It was like someone had breathed on them from the outside, and the fog had frozen. I thought it was weird, but I didn't think too much about it. I was just a teenager trying to get through my day, you know? So I hopped on the bus and made my way to my usual seat. The inside of the bus was dim, even though the sun was up. I could see the other kids, some of them still half asleep, others chatting away. But there was something off about the atmosphere. It was quieter than usual, and it was like everyone was holding something back. No one was laughing or joking. The whole bus felt tense. I sat down next to my best friend, Sarah, who was already staring out the window, her face pale. She turned to me and gave me a weird look. "Emma, do you feel that?" she whispered, almost like she was afraid to speak too loud. "Feel what?" I asked, glancing around. "It's just a bus ride." "No, no, something's wrong. I swear, it's like we're not alone." I laughed a little, trying to brush it off, but the look on her face made me uneasy. "You're being dramatic. It's just the bus." But then I noticed it too. There was something strange in the back of the bus. I couldn't make it out at first, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The bus driver, Mr. Haynes, was a quiet man who didn't like talking much. He always had that faraway look in his eyes, like he was never really there. But this morning, he wasn't even looking in the rearview mirror. He had his head tilted down, his hands gripping the wheel tight. "Something's not right," I muttered to Sarah, but before she could answer, I saw it again. At the back of the bus, in the very last seat, was a man. I was pretty sure I had seen everyone on the bus that morning, but there he was, sitting there, staring at the floor. He was wearing an old brown leather jacket, the kind that looked like it had been through a lot. His hair was dark, but greasy, and his skin was pale, almost sickly. He looked out of place, like he didn't belong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something about him was wrong. "Sarah, do you see that?" I asked, my voice low, trying not to alert the others. She nodded slowly, her eyes wide. "Who is that guy? He wasn't on the bus yesterday." I had no idea, but it didn't sit right with me. The guy was too still, too silent. The bus was usually full of chatter, but he sat there like he didn't even notice the other kids, like he didn't even care. And that was the first thing that made me uneasy. But what happened next made my stomach drop. The man turned his head slowly, so slowly that I could almost hear his neck crack. His eyes locked onto mine. There was no emotion in his face, just a cold emptiness. It wasn't like he was looking at me, it was like he was looking through me, like he was searching for something. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. For a moment, it felt like the entire world had stopped. The bus was too quiet, the air too thick, and all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat. Suddenly, the man stood up, but not in a normal way. He didn't move like a person. His movements were stiff, jerky, like he was forcing himself to move. And then, without a word, he started walking down the aisle toward me. I felt Sarah grab my arm, like her grip tight. "Emma, what's going on? What's he doing?" I couldn't answer. I didn't know. I didn't want to know. The man's footsteps echoed on the bus floor, each step making the hairs on my arms stand on end. As he got closer, I could smell something foul, like rotten meat. It wasn't coming from anyone else. It was just him. His presence filled the whole space with a sense of dread. The bus was still moving down Oak Drive, but it felt like we were stuck, like we were in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt tight. I wanted to get up, run, but my legs wouldn't move. The man was inches away from me now, his face still expressionless. And then, just as he was about to reach out, Mr. Haynes slammed on the brakes. The bus jerked forward, and I heard everyone around me gasp, but when I looked back, the man was gone. There was no trace of him, no footsteps, nothing. I turned to Sarah, my heart racing. "Did you see that?" She nodded, her face pale. "Where did he go? I don't know what just happened." The bus was still. The only sound was the engine running. No one was talking. It felt like time had frozen. Mr. Haynes didn't say a word. He didn't even look in the rearview mirror. He just kept driving. But I knew something was wrong. That wasn't just a strange man. It wasn't some random guy who had gotten on by mistake. No, there was something off about him. Something otherworldly. I felt it deep in my bones. The bus kept driving down Oak Drive, past the same houses, past the same trees, and for the rest of the ride, I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, waiting for him to show up again. He never did. When we got to school, I told Sarah I was going to talk to Mr. Haynes. I needed to know who that guy was, where he went. But when I walked up to the front of the bus, Mr. Haynes was gone. The door was open, and the bus was empty. I searched the parking lot, thinking maybe he had gone for a break or something, but there was no sign of him. No man in the brown jacket. No bus driver. Nothing. I never saw him again. But I'll never forget the feeling of his eyes on me, or the way he moved, or the smell that came with him. There are days when I still feel like I'm being watched, like he's out there somewhere, just waiting. And maybe he is. Because sometimes I hear the sound of footsteps behind me, slow and steady. But when I turn around, there's no one there. And now, every time I take the bus, I can't shake the feeling that he's still there, somewhere, just waiting to step out of the shadows. It was a Tuesday morning, just like any other, or so I thought. My name's Josh, and I'm 17. I live in a quiet area in the northeastern part of the country, a place where nothing really ever happens. It's one of those towns that's big enough to have a few schools, but small enough that everyone knows each other. If you've been to one, you've been to them all. Tree-lined streets, old houses, and local shops that have been around for decades. On mornings like this, the routine was always the same. I'd wake up, grab a quick breakfast, and walk to my bus stop. My bus stop was just a few blocks away, right by the corner near a small park. It wasn't anything special, just a quiet corner of the neighborhood where the houses looked like they belonged in a different decade. A street light that flickered every now and then, a few stray leaves blowing around, and the faint sound of birds in the trees. The kind of place where nothing out of the ordinary ever happens. At least that's what I thought. I wasn't the first one at the stop, which wasn't surprising. My friends Jenna and Kyle usually beat me there. But when I got there, the street was empty. No bus, no friends, just silence. At first, I thought I was just running late. Maybe the bus was behind schedule. After all, these things happen, right? The bus had been late a couple of times before, but it always showed up eventually. Still, something about this felt different. I checked my watch, 7:45 a.m. The bus was supposed to be there at 7:30. I pulled out my phone and checked the bus tracker app, but there was nothing on there. No updates. Nothing about a delay. Just that the bus was on time, whatever that meant. By now, I was getting a little annoyed. Jenna and Kyle should have been there by now, and the bus still hadn't shown up. Maybe I'll just walk, I muttered to myself. It wasn't a long walk, maybe 15 minutes, but still, I didn't want to be late. Just as I turned to start walking towards school, I heard something, the faint hum of an engine. At first, it was so quiet I wasn't sure I'd even heard it. But then it got louder. The sound of a bus engine revving in the distance. I turned around, hoping that it was finally the bus, but what I saw made my heart stop. There it was, my bus, the one I saw every day. But it wasn't slowing down. It was moving fast, much faster than normal. And instead of stopping at the bus stop, it just zoomed past me like it hadn't even seen me standing there. I blinked, completely confused. There was no way I'd missed it. I was standing right at the stop. I waved my arms in the air, but the bus didn't stop. It just kept going, disappearing around the corner at the end of the block. Now I felt uneasy. Maybe I was just half asleep, or maybe the bus driver didn't see me. I tried to brush it off, telling myself there was a simple explanation, but something didn't sit right with me. But something didn't sit right with me. It wasn't until later that afternoon, after school, when the news broke that everything started to click into place. I had just finished my last class and I was heading out of the building when I got a text from my mom. It was short, simple, and to the point. Turn on the news now. I didn't question it. I pulled out my phone, opened the news app, and was greeted with a headline that froze me in my tracks. School bus found abandoned in forest, driver and passengers missing. My heart dropped into my stomach. I clicked on the article, but it was short, too short. The bus I had seen that morning, the one that had passed me without stopping, was found later that day in a remote area just outside town. The police had discovered it in the middle of a small forest, its engine still running, and the doors wide open. But here was the kicker. The bus was completely empty. There was no sign of the driver, no sign of any of the students who had been riding it that morning. The only things left behind were scattered backpacks and a few dropped school supplies. It was like everyone had disappeared into thin air, and there was no explanation for why it happened. I read through the article over and over again, my hands trembling. The bus had been found abandoned, just like it was waiting for someone to come back. But no one had. Not the driver, not any of the kids who had been on it. Nothing. Just that still running engine, the backpacks, and the eerie silence. I didn't know what to think. I couldn't stop staring at my phone, trying to wrap my head around it. That bus was supposed to stop for me. I was supposed to be on it, and yet I hadn't been. A few hours later, the local news aired a report with some more details. They said they'd searched the area around the bus and found no footprints, no signs of a struggle, and no evidence that anything had happened. It was like everyone had just gotten off the bus and walked into the forest, but there was nothing to indicate where they had gone. No tracks, no clues, just an empty bus. The police were baffled. They didn't have any answers, and no one was talking. I sat in front of the TV, staring at the images of the bus, the open doors, the abandoned bags scattered on the ground. It felt like a nightmare, a bad dream that I couldn't wake up from. And then the rumors started. People in town started whispering about it, about how strange the whole thing was. Some said that it was just a big coincidence, that the driver had maybe made a wrong turn or had been distracted. Others said it was something more, something much darker. Some even mentioned old urban legends about things that happened in the woods around here, things about people who had gone missing in those woods, things that no one could explain, but no one knew the truth. And then came the real kicker. A week after the bus had been found, the police released a statement saying they had found more evidence in the forest, clothing, shoes, and some personal items. But still, no bodies, no trace of the driver or any of the missing students. It was like they had just vanished, gone without a single trace. I couldn't stop thinking about it, about how that bus had passed me by that morning. I kept wondering what would have happened if I'd been on it. Would I have disappeared too? Would I have been one of the kids who was left behind in the forest? Or was I spared for some reason? I tried to forget about it, to go on with my life. But every time I heard a bus engine in the distance, my heart would skip a beat. Every time I passed that same corner where I was supposed to be waiting, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching me. I still don't know what happened to that bus. I don't know if the driver and the kids will ever be found. I don't know if they were taken or if something more sinister was at play. But what I do know is that I'll never forget that morning. The bus that passed me by. The empty bus that was found abandoned in the forest. And every time I walk past that same corner now, I can't help but wonder if I was meant to get on that bus that day. If maybe something or someone was waiting for me, waiting for all of us. It was just another normal Wednesday. The kind of day where you don't expect anything to happen, yet something strange always seems to creep up on you when you least expect it. My name's Mia, and I'm 17, living in a small town somewhere in the middle of nowhere. No one would ever expect anything spooky to happen in a place like this. We've got a few small schools, a couple of fast food places, and just enough people to make it feel like a real town. Not much, but enough to keep it interesting. So, yeah, the whole town is quiet. Boring, really. I guess that's what made this story so much stranger when it happened. I've always been the techie type, the one who messes around with gadgets, hacks things just for fun, and spends hours figuring out how stuff works. That's how I ended up discovering something no one was supposed to know. It started one regular morning when I got on the bus. Nothing unusual at first, same old route, same old kids, same old bus driver. I walked up the steps of the bus, nodding to a few friends who were already sitting down. The bus driver, Mr. Gage, was sitting there like always, with his old cap on, his eyes half lidded like he hadn't slept in days. He wasn't a bad guy, just kind of quiet. He mostly kept to himself, never talking much to the kids. I didn't think much of it. The ride started as usual, kids talking, some playing games, some staring out the windows. I sat down next to my friend Jess, and we started chatting. But halfway through the ride, I noticed something odd. There was this faint buzzing sound, like the sound of a camera lens adjusting or something. It was so quiet, I thought I was imagining it at first. But the more I listened, the more it became clear. It was coming from the ceiling of the bus. Now, I'm not one to just ignore things like that. My curiosity got the better of me, and after a few more days of hearing the same faint noise, I decided to check it out. I was heading to the back of the bus to grab my bag one morning when I noticed something on the ceiling above the seats. It was a small black dot, barely visible, but it was there. It looked like a camera lens. At first, I thought it was just part of the bus's interior, like maybe an emergency camera or something. But the longer I stared at it, the more uneasy I felt. This wasn't a typical camera. I had worked with cameras before. I knew what they looked like. And this one wasn't supposed to be there. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The buzzing sound, the weird placement of the camera, it all started to seem too deliberate. So, I did what any curious techie would do. I got my phone out and started recording the camera, hoping to catch some kind of sign, maybe a brand name or some sort of model number. But after a while, I realized that wasn't going to be enough. I needed to know what the camera was recording. That night, I sneaked into the bus garage. I knew the bus would be parked there after school hours, and I had a plan. I had done some research on how the bus system worked in our area, and I figured out that the footage was likely stored in a hidden device somewhere in the driver's compartment. I snuck in, avoided the security cameras in the parking lot, and found the bus. It wasn't hard to spot. It was the same bus we took every day, the same old model. It looked completely normal from the outside. But the more I looked, the more my hands shook with anticipation. I pulled open the side door, which luckily wasn't locked, and climbed inside. I knew what I was doing. This was my area of expertise. Within a few minutes, I found the small hidden compartment near the driver's seat. My heart was pounding in my chest as I unscrewed the panel, and inside was exactly what I was hoping to find, a small recording device with a few blinking lights. It was a DVR system. I almost couldn't believe it. Whoever had set this up had gone to a lot of trouble to hide it in there, almost like they knew no one would ever think to look. But I wasn't going to back down now. I pulled out the device and, using a USB cable I had brought with me, I transferred the footage onto my laptop. I plugged in the laptop, opened the file, and started watching the footage. At first, it was just the usual bus rides, nothing strange. You could see kids getting on and off, laughing, talking, doing their usual teenage stuff. But as I kept watching, I started to notice something unsettling. The footage wasn't just from a few days ago. It wasn't just from a few weeks ago. No, it was going back years. I scrolled through file after file, and what I found was beyond anything I could have imagined. Every single student who had ever ridden that bus was logged. Their faces, their names, the exact dates and times they were on the bus, every little detail. It was like some twisted archive, collecting information on everyone who'd ever stepped foot on that bus. But there was more. There were notes about each kid. Some said things like, "doesn't belong here," or "watch closely." Others were more cryptic, like "followed her home." It was chilling. I couldn't stop scrolling. I felt like I was stumbling upon something much darker than I had ever intended to. But the worst part was the last file. I clicked on it, my hands trembling, and a single video clip opened up. It was recorded only a few days ago. And in it, there was Mr. Gage, the bus driver. He was sitting in the driver's seat, his face lit by the screen of the recording device. He looked almost pleased. And as the camera zoomed in, I saw him type a name into the system. My name. My heart stopped. I didn't know what to think. Why was he tracking me? Why was I being logged in with everyone else? But before I could process it, the door of the bus creaked open behind me. It was Mr. Gage. I didn't know how long he had been standing there, but he must have seen everything. My stomach dropped to my feet as I spun around to face him, the device still in my hands. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice shaky. I didn't want to know, but I needed to hear it from him. Mr. Gage didn't say anything at first. He just stared at me with cold, calculating eyes, like he was studying me. Then he spoke in a low voice, "No one can know." Before I could even react, he grabbed the device from my hands. I took a step back, but he was too quick. He pushed the button on the dashboard and the bus lurched forward, taking a sharp turn down an unfamiliar street. I felt my heart race as I realized something was wrong. We were no longer on the main road. We were heading into a part of town I didn't recognize. I tried to speak, to ask him what was going on, but he just kept driving, his grip on the wheel tight. His expression was blank, but there was something almost sadistic about it. Finally, he turned to me and said, "You can't unsee this. No one can know about the footage. Do you understand?" I nodded, terrified, but the feeling of dread only grew as we drove further. I didn't know what would happen next, but I had the sickening feeling that I was in much deeper than I had ever planned on being. And when we finally stopped, I knew my life would never be the same. It was the beginning of a new school year, and I remember it like it was yesterday. My name's Ryan, and I'm 16 years old. I've always lived in a small, quiet area in the middle of nowhere, where things never really change. The roads are mostly empty except for the occasional car passing through, and we've had the same bus driver for years. Everyone knew Mrs. Marlowe. She was old, but she knew every student by name, and her bus rides were mostly uneventful. A little too quiet, maybe, but nothing ever strange. Then came the new bus driver. I don't know how he ended up taking over for Mrs. Marlowe, but I first saw him on the first day of the new school year. His name was Mr. Holt, and from the moment I saw him, something felt off. He wasn't like Mrs. Marlowe. He was younger, maybe in his 30s, with short, dark hair, a stern face, and these piercing eyes that seemed to look right through you. It wasn't just his appearance, though. It was the way he carried himself, the way he stared at us all through the rearview mirror like he was sizing us up, uh, checking for something. I'll admit I didn't think much of it at first. After all, he was just a bus driver, right? But then came the rules. He was very clear about them when we all climbed on that first day. He stood at the front of the bus, his arms crossed tightly, and he looked at all of us with that cold stare. "No talking," he said, his voice low but firm. "No moving between seats. No phones. You follow those rules or you don't ride my bus." At first, we all just kind of looked at each other, confused. A bus without talking? No phones? It didn't make sense. We were used to Mrs. Marlowe letting us chat and joke around on the way to school, so this new atmosphere was jarring. But we shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just a one-time thing. Maybe he was just trying to get everyone's attention. But no, it wasn't a one-time thing. Every single day, Mr. Holt enforced those rules strictly. The bus was dead silent the whole ride. No one dared talk. No one moved from their seats, not even if they had to adjust for comfort. The moment anyone pulled out a phone, he would stop the bus, look straight at them through the mirror, and say in his calm voice, "Put it away." I'll admit, at first I thought it was all a bit ridiculous. I didn't like him much, and I didn't understand why he was being so strict. It wasn't like we were causing trouble. But after a few weeks, the other kids started following the rules too. Everyone did. No one wanted to risk angering him. He had this way about him, a way of making you feel like if you stepped out of line, something bad would happen. I was getting used to it. The silence, the stillness. It was like riding through a ghost town every day, with just the rumble of the bus to fill the air. But one afternoon, things changed. It was a rainy Tuesday, and I was sitting near the back of the bus, my backpack on the seat next to me. My mom had texted me earlier that day, asking me to let her know when I'd be home, so I decided to quickly text her back. It wasn't like anyone would notice, right? The rain was pouring down, and the sound of it hitting the roof of the bus drowned out any noise. Mr. Holt was focused on the road, so I figured it was safe. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, thinking I'd just type a quick reply and slide it back in. But as soon as I started typing, I felt this odd, heavy feeling in the air. It was like I was being watched. I glanced up, and Mr. Holt's eyes were in the rearview mirror, locked on me. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly shoved my phone back in my pocket. I thought for a second he was going to stop the bus and yell at me like he'd done with the others, but he didn't. He just kept driving, his eyes still fixed on the mirror. It was awkward, but I thought everything would be fine. I had only texted for a second. He probably didn't even see much, right? But then my phone buzzed. It was a message from my mom, or at least I thought it was. I pulled my phone out again, but this time I hesitated. Something didn't feel right. The message didn't come from her usual contact name. It just said unknown at the top, but I opened it anyway, and that's when my blood ran cold. The message read, "That's not your real bus driver. Get off now." I stared at the screen, my fingers frozen on the phone. It didn't make sense. I double-checked the contact. It wasn't my mom. It wasn't anyone I knew. Just some random number. My heart started pounding in my chest. I looked up, but Mr. Holt's eyes were still in the rearview mirror, locked on me. He hadn't moved. He didn't blink. He just kept driving, his expression like stone. I quickly closed my phone and slid it back into my pocket, my mind racing. Who was texting me? And why would they say that? Then something strange happened. As if reading my thoughts, Mr. Holt spoke without turning his head. "Don't break the rules again," he said, his voice calm, almost too calm. "It's better if you don't." I felt a chill run down my spine. Was he talking about the phone, or was he talking about something else? The bus felt heavier now. The air felt thicker, like it was hard to breathe. I looked out the window, but the world outside seemed far away, distant. I wanted to get off. I wanted to just leave, to forget about this bus, this driver, everything. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized there was something I couldn't explain. I was trapped. When I got home that afternoon, I told my mom about the weird text. She didn't seem too concerned at first, chalking it up to a prank. But when I mentioned Mr. Holt's strange behavior, how he seemed to know exactly what I was doing, she stopped and looked at me. "Ryan, are you sure?" she asked, her voice suddenly serious. "Sure about what?" I asked, confused. "About the bus driver. Are you sure that's who you think it is?" she said. "I've been hearing strange things from other parents. Things about how he never seems to have any history, no references, no one really knows where he came from." That's when I felt it, like the ground was shaking beneath me, like the world I knew was suddenly spinning out of control. Mr. Holt had appeared out of nowhere. No one knew anything about him. I didn't know what to think. Maybe it was just a coincidence, maybe it wasn't. But something deep down told me it wasn't over. The next day, I didn't take the bus. I told my mom I was walking to school, that I didn't want to deal with the weirdness anymore, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Every time I saw a bus, every time I saw a driver, I couldn't help but wonder if it was him, if he was watching me. I still don't know who sent that text or why Mr. Holt seemed to know exactly what I was doing, but every day I keep thinking back to the message. "That's not your real bus driver. Get off now." And now, every time I see that bus go by, I wonder, what if I hadn't followed the rules? What would have happened then? End of story 4.